All right, good morning, students. This is Dr. Esmacher, and today we're going to be talking about the end of Reconstruction and the birth of Jim Crow. So you guys have been reading in your textbook about Reconstruction. Remember that Reconstruction had two phases, presidential Reconstruction or Andrew Johnson's plan, in which not really all that much changed for the South. In fact, Johnson pardoned pretty much everyone in the South, and the system went back to the status quo pre-Civil War, other than no more slavery was allowed. Because presidential Reconstruction didn't really reconstruct the South so much as make things exactly the same way that they had been before, this is when Congress stepped in and passed radical Reconstruction. So this takes place from 1867 through the end of Reconstruction, which we're going to talk about today in 1877. And radical Reconstruction really did radically change the South. As you guys have been reading about radical Reconstruction, significantly remade Southern governments by refusing to accept as legitimate the previous attempts to rewrite Southern constitutions, and instead stating that new Southern state constitutions were not acceptable until they had been drafted by all of the people. And so this meant that elite white Southerners could no longer ignore African Americans who now had equal opportunity, including the right to vote guaranteed by the 15th Amendment, and poor whites, who oftentimes have been excluded from political power before the Civil War. So radical Reconstruction thoroughly remade the South. It was a far more inclusive process, but it did manage to ruffle a lot of feathers. And there were other things going on during the time period of radical Reconstruction that significantly weakened the promise of drastically remaking the South. So today we're going to talk about how Reconstruction ends and what takes its place in the South. So radical Reconstruction always had its opponents and Southerners who had benefited from the status quo of the old antebellum South. In particular, there was a lot of discontent over the state of the Southern economy. While railroads helped improve things in urban areas, rural areas were still not as plugged in to the market system. Then we also had the problem of low cotton prices because during the Civil War, the British Empire in particular had responded to the inability to get Southern cotton by simply growing it in new places like Egypt and India. And so this global competition over cotton, along with the sharecropping system, which locked poor white and black farmers into this never-ending cycle of debt, trying to farm land that they were renting, really does drag the Southern economy down. And as the economy continues to struggle and recovery does not seem to be in sight anytime soon, this prompts even more folks to object to Reconstruction, particularly the higher taxes necessary to build schools and hospitals and other infrastructure that Reconstruction era governments had tried to do. There was also the allegation that governments were corrupt in the Reconstruction era South. A lot of people sort of alleged that the folks pulling the strings in Southern states were carpetbaggers or people from the North who had come down, and they were oftentimes depicted as sort of vultures feeding on the carcass of the South. While this is a very popular perception, the evidence suggests that corruption was not widespread throughout Reconstruction era Southern state governments. Certainly at the top level, at the federal level, especially under President Grant, we're going to see a lot of corruption, but not in the Southern state levels, not to the extent that people sort of spread rumors about. And then one of the big things that sparked opposition and indeed violent opposition to Reconstruction was this notion of race and power. Particularly, many Southern whites objected to the fact that not only were African Americans no longer enslaved, but that they were guaranteed equal rights and protection under the Constitution, by the 14th Amendment and guaranteed the right to vote by the 15th Amendment. And so many Southern white folks started to become resentful of the fact that they no longer had a monopoly on power. They saw these new rights granted to African Americans as something that diminished their power as white people, and they objected to the fact that African Americans had equal participation in politics. They could now vote, they could now hold office, they helped rewrite new Southern state constitutions, and this sparked violence. In particular, a new group out of Tennessee, established by former Confederate General Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, excuse me, Nathan Bedford Forrest, I always get his name wrong. The Ku Klux Klan was formed in 1866. The Ku Klux Klan was a group committed to acts of violence to intimidate African American voters and politicians. The Ku Klux Klan specifically worked through vigilante actions to try to threaten their opponents into submission by either threatening acts of violence, things such as burning crosses, or actually carrying out acts of violence. And here you can see in this political cartoon, the Ku Klux Klan here is threatening through lynching folks like carpetbaggers. So you can see this represented by the guy who's carrying this suitcase or carpet bag labeled Ohio. That the Ku Klux Klan was not only objecting to African Americans exercising their political rights, but also through carpetbaggers in supporting these new Reconstruction era governments, or scalawags, which were Southerners who were Republicans who were seen as sort of betraying their Southern white identity by working with carpetbaggers or Northerners and African Americans. The Ku Klux Klan used violence as a tool of control. In fact, President Grant had to step in, and Congress passed the Enforcement Acts in 1870 and 1871, which declared the Ku Klux Klan a domestic terrorist organization and cracked down on the Klan by prosecuting those that they found as Klan members. Now, it's not just the Ku Klux Klan, but other individuals taking their interpretation of the law into their own hands that use violence. And in particular, there are two different types of violence that are oftentimes used as a means of controlling a population. One method of violent control is riots. Now, today, when we think about riots in the context of protest movements. So, for example, I'm recording this in 2020, so we think of riots in the form of protests after, say, the death of George Floyd in summer 2020 at the hands of a white police officer. So we tend to associate riots today with protest movements for civil rights or drunk fans celebrating after their team wins a sporting event. That is not the type of riot I'm talking about here. Riots during this time period, and indeed through World War II, were carried out by white vigilante mobs against minority populations as a means to try to threaten and punish the entire community for acting out of line. For example, you may have been made more aware of the Tulsa riot in 1921, which was referenced very heavily in the film Watchmen, and also slightly, in the series Watchmen that came out in 2020, and also referenced in the more recent 2020 series Lovecraft Country. This was one of the worst riots in U.S. history that attacked the Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is a classic example of a riot carried out to punish a whole community. In the case of Tulsa, the economic success of the community. And during Reconstruction era, oftentimes communities were targeted for violence if they were seen as exercising their rights too much. For example, the Colfax massacre in Colfax, Louisiana in 1873 happened because white vigilante mobs were threatening African Americans who were exercising their right to vote because it was an election. And again, the number of people that were killed in Colfax is difficult to ascertain. Usually riots are very messy and difficult to prosecute people who carry out acts of violence and riots. But the body count in Colfax numbered something in the hundreds, and again, attacked by armed whites for trying to exercise their right to vote in an election. So riots are, again, vigilante actions against an entire community, usually minorities. So while we're talking specifically about African Americans in the context of Reconstruction South, we also see riots targeting Asian Americans and Latinos in the American West and Southwest as well during the same time period. So again, this is kind of actions carried out by vigilante white mobs against minority communities. The other type of violence as a tool of control is lynching. Lynching is the act of killing someone who you believe has either broken the law or broken some sort of social taboo. Lynching, again, is vigilante violence because even if the person is accused of a crime that they could be prosecuted for under our legal system, here they are denied their due process of law. They are denied access to a trial by jury of their peers to be presumed innocent until otherwise found guilty. And lynching targets individuals who were seen as acting out of line. Lynching is a very effective tool of social control. And I want to talk a little bit more about lynching. To do this, we're going to be looking at lynching photography, because during this time period, lynching photography is actually a very popular genre in the United States. And lynching photos are hard to look at. I'm a historian who specializes in violence, and it gets to you after a while. I never cease to be amazed at how cruel humans can be to one another. So what I want to suggest to you for a second is to pause before we look at lynching photos and to try to cue up your mental happy place. So in other words, when you're sad or stressed, like what image do you think of in your head to make you feel better? So for me, my mental happy place is sitting on a beach playing with a basket full of puppies. Okay, so whatever your mental happy place is, take a second to think about it. And if you've got it queued up already, great. If not, pause until you're ready. And we're going to start looking at lynching photos. So keep that happy place in the background as we look at some disturbing pictures. All right, so the first lynching photo we're going to look at is actually an example of a postcard. Lynching postcards were actually very popular in the South, not only during Reconstruction, but also after. As you can see, this postcard is taken, this picture on this postcard is taken in Alabama in 1891. Okay. Lynching postcards were seen as souvenirs from these acts of violence and shared among friend and family. As you can see here in the picture, if you look at the crowd who's looking on to this poor man who has been lynched, you see kids. Now you might think to yourself, that's really disturbed that you would bring your children there. But many Southern whites did not see this as disturbing. In fact, if you Google lynching photography and do a Google image search, again, with your happy place on deck, and you look at it, you'll find all kinds of examples of crowds with children in these lynching photos. And part of this was that Southerners, and indeed white people, because this happens outside the South too, saw this as a normal event. They saw this as something to take their kids to, as an example of what happens when somebody is out of line, number one. Number two, to kind of reinforce this sense of white supremacy and this sense of vigilantism, that it's perfectly normal to take the law into your own hands if the person has been guilty of something. There's a very famous lynching photo where it has a girl very creepily smiling up at the corpse. And yeah, this is an example of how many white folks, especially in the South during this time period, treated lynchings as community events similar to like picnics, which is really disturbing. We also have documented practices like taking souvenirs from the lynched individuals, such as chopping off fingers and toes. Photos are probably the most common version of a souvenir. And you can see here in the illustration, if you can read cursive, they're describing the lynching here. It says this SOB was hung at Clayton on Friday, August 21st, 1891, for murdering a little, I think it's his boy, in cold blood. And then it's a little hard to see the rest of the writing because it's over really sort of fancy background. But again, the accusation here is that he's killed, presumably a white boy, but instead of being arrested and going through the process of a trial and a sentencing by a judge, the community instead took it upon themselves to capture him and to kill him by hanging. Many lynchings are done with hanging. Some lynchings also involve burning or dragging the person to death behind a vehicle. In other words, lynchings are acts of violence that result in death. Black men in the South were the most common victims of lynching. Again, we also see lynching of Asian men and Latino men in the West and Southwest during the same time period. But just because men were the most likely victims of lynching did not mean they were the only ones. In fact, as you can see in this photograph from 1911, we have two victims here, a man sort of hanging in the middle, and then you can see sort of over a break in the river, a woman being executed as well. One of the reasons that men tended to be victims of lynching violence was very commonly Black men were accused of sexual contact, whether violent or with consent, with white women. For example, one of the more famous lynchings in American history, the lynching of Emmett Till in Mississippi in 1955, was because he had been accused of whistling at a white woman. If you take History 1302, we talk about Emmett Till and his death as sort of a catalyst for the 1950s civil rights movement. So lynching was done during this time period mostly in the South, although as I mentioned again, you could also see lynchings happening anywhere there was a significant minority population and white people either felt threatened by the entire community or in the case of lynching, by specific individuals who they pointed out as having broken taboos, whether literally broken laws or breaking social taboos like being involved in an interracial relationship. So take a moment to visit your happy place again before we move on. Beach and puppies, beach and puppies. All right. So, as I mentioned, the Enforcement Act really did cut down on the violence of organized groups like Ku Klux Klan, but it didn't do much to diminish unorganized violence like riots and lynching. But as violence persisted in the South, despite the Ku Klux Klan being pretty well squashed by the early 1870s, Northerners grew very weary of having to intervene in the South and try to crack down on violence. And in particular, we have a new generation of Republican politicians coming up who got the nickname liberal Republicans. So the radical Republicans who had been behind radical Reconstruction had started to die off. Many of them were fairly old before the Civil War even began. And in their place, this new group of Republicans, the liberal Republicans, specifically opposed Ulysses S. Grant, who was president at the time, and again, also a Republican. But they get their start opposing corruption in Grant's administration, and then came to adopt views that were more sympathetic towards Southern white people. So liberal Republicans start to think that Reconstruction as a process has failed, that it has failed to fix the Southern economy, that it has failed to instill new social order, that it is draining Northern resources in terms of manpower and money, and that the South should be returned to control of the elite white Southerners. So, along with liberal Republicans starting to push for an end to Reconstruction for those reasons, we also see, in general, among the Northern population, a lack of support for Reconstruction. There's the rise of racist rhetoric in Northern politics. A severe economic depression in 1873 really sort of puts a strain on the national government resources. And again, the argument of why are we spending all this money in the South if it doesn't seem to be working? And we also see the Supreme Court weakening the enforcement acts. In particular, we start to see the Supreme Court chipping away at legal protections for African Americans and legislative progress for African Americans. For example, the perpetrators of the Colfax massacre, a few of them had managed to be successfully prosecuted for killing African Americans in the riot at Colfax. However, when they appealed their convictions to the Supreme Court tossed out the convictions of the Colfax perpetrators. So in the North, there's weakening support for this process of Reconstruction. What finally ends up killing Reconstruction is the rise of a group called Redeemers. Okay. The Redeemers were a group that felt that it was their duty to rescue or redeem the South. In particular, they were identified as Democrats in opposition to Republicans who were associated very heavily with Lincoln and the North and the Union and the Civil War. And these Redeemers started to become elected to positions in Southern legislatures in the 1870s, running on the campaign promise that they would save the South from the evils of Reconstruction. They started, once they got elected, rolling back legislation that they disliked and also embracing violence to terrorize African Americans who tried to exercise their right to vote. So we see another wave of violence sanctioned by these Redeemer politicians throughout the South. And so we see repeated violations of the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection under law to every person, and the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote for all men, regardless of race. Women still not included at this point. So over and over again, the rights of African Americans to have equal protection under the law and the right for them to vote is being threatened with extra legal violence. The final sort of nail in the coffin for Reconstruction is the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876. The popularity of Redeemers makes the South competitive in this election, and Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden ended up tying the Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes in several Southern states, which created a problem in the Electoral College, because by this point, many states had declared a sort of winner-take-all system for their Electoral College votes, so whoever won the popular vote in the state gets all of the Electoral College votes. Unfortunately, when it's a tie in the Electoral College, it gets complicated. So to try to fix this complication, excuse me, Congress created an electoral commission made up of members of Congress along with Supreme Court justices to try to settle this election and determine a winner. The Republicans had an 8-7 advantage in this electoral commission, and they end up deciding the election for Rutherford B. Hayes because of a backroom deal. In exchange for being elected and for Southerners supporting his election as a Republican, right, when many of these Redeemers were Democrat, Hayes promised to recognize Redeemer control of the South and to formally declare an end to Reconstruction. So in other words, in 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes is inaugurated as president, he declares a formal end to the Reconstruction process in the South. Now, Hayes did ask for the South to respect the civil and political rights of African Americans as a condition to end Reconstruction, to which essentially Southerners said, sure, we'll do that, and then proceeded not to do that. So with the end of Reconstruction, we have the birth of a new system in the South, Jim Crow. So Redeemer-controlled Southern legislators started passing legislation to try to enshrine white supremacy into law. So these new laws passed in the South specifically enacted things like public segregation, which was possible, again, with sympathetic support from the Supreme Court, which basically said that in 1896, in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, that separate but equal spaces were legally permissible. So Jim Crow is the nickname we give to this system of legal segregation that arises in the South after Reconstruction, in which spaces are physically separated for white and non-white populations in the South, and laws are passed that apply primarily to minorities. The rights of voters, non-white voters, are targeted through various means. Things like grandfather clauses, which said that you could not register to vote unless your grandfather had been eligible to vote, which rules out African Americans whose grandfathers had been enslaved, and also immigrants. We also see things like poll taxes come up, in which you have to pay a fee or a tax to be able to vote, which not only targets minority populations, which were poorer on average, but also poor white people. And then we also have things like literacy tests, in which you had to take a test to vote, not a simple test of whether you could read, but in most cases, tests that asked you very obscure questions about American government, like, for example, who the current Solicitor General of the United States is. And I bet you don't know that right now, or even what a Solicitor General is. Other tests that we've seen evidence of included really nonsensical sort of logic puzzles. And again, this test is ostensibly just supposed to be about if you can read. So voting rights were greatly diminished through these sorts of tactics, and again, through threats of continued violence. And very quickly after Reconstruction officially ends in 1877, we have these Southern state governments trying to undo as much as possible about Reconstruction. So defunding public school systems, which only started to exist in the South because of radical Reconstruction, of slashing property taxes, which benefited elite white people, but again, kind of starved money for programs meant for poorer Southerners. And also embracing elements of presidential Reconstruction, including bringing back a version of the Black Codes, one of the more controversial parts of presidential Reconstruction, in which Southern states have passed laws targeting African Americans and basically saying if they didn't have jobs lined up for a year in advance at any given time, they could be arrested and put to work, because the 13th Amendment banned slavery, with the exception of prison labor. And so we see a return to that in Southern states post-Reconstruction with the convict leasing system, in which Southern states start to lease out prisoners for pennies on the dollar to do manual labor, like constructing railroads, working on plantations, mining, and we can still see the legacies of some of those convict leasing systems today. We still have prison labor, although for the most part, they don't tend to be rented out for sort of hard manual labor anymore. But still, this idea that prisoners can be forced to work and legally not be paid for their work still persists because of that loophole in the 13th Amendment. The legal system of Jim Crow exists in the South, but a sort of informal social Jim Crow, this sort of informal segregation of races exists outside of the South as well. We see legalized Jim Crow in areas like California, which adopted a segregated public school system, not only separating white and non-white students, but even different non-white groups of students, such as Asians and Latinos and Hispanics, or excuse me, Latinos and African Americans. But we also see sort of informal segregation extending throughout the nation, including in the North, through practices like racially restrictive covenants. So in other words, putting it in the deed of your house about who can live there. So informal Jim Crow is alive and well throughout the United States, but it's really only in the South and in some places in the Southwest, like California, where it's enshrined into the legal system. Now, after Reconstruction ends, we sort of have a reimagining of the Civil War going on, in part because when Reconstruction ends, there's this desire to heal divisions in the South and the North by bringing people together. So we have the reunification of some church denominations, such as the Methodist Church, which had split over the issue of slavery. The Baptist Church never reconciles, and still today, Southern Baptists and other Baptists are there. That legacy, that split, comes from before the Civil War, split over the issue of slavery. This is where we start to have people sort of reimagine the Civil War as a family feud of brother versus brother fighting. And this is also where we have this idea of a lost cause bubbling up to the surface. So let's talk about the lost cause myth for a second, because it is just that, a myth. According to the lost cause, the South nobly fought for states' rights. The Civil War had nothing to do with the institution of slavery, and the South had been horribly, cruelly victimized by Northern carpetbaggers during Reconstruction, who had sought out to oppress white Southerners, and that the end of Reconstruction and the arrival of the Redeemers had helped to save the South from the evil clutches of Northern states. Now, what the lost cause mythology doesn't want to talk about is that slavery is the main driver of the Civil War. They go, no, it had nothing to do with slavery, just state rights. But it was about the states' rights to own slaves. You cannot separate slavery from the Civil War. If you go back and you look at the declarations of secession from states like South Carolina, you look at the writings of Confederate politicians, especially Alexander Stephens, who's the vice president of the Confederacy, it's all about slavery, and they are very, very clear on that point. So if this is a myth, if it doesn't reflect reality, then why are we telling this story at all? Why is the lost cause myth still popular today in 2020? Well, for one thing, it's really hard to admit that you're a loser, right? That the Confederacy and the South had lost the Civil War. So they're trying to kind of put a shine on this by saying, well, we fought nobly for a cause we believe in, even if we lost. It also paints them as victims of this sort of aggressive North and wanting to sort of wreck their way of life and their culture by being cruel enough to demand that they stop slavery. Part of the other reason, too, is that this kind of casts the Civil War as a mere disagreement over rights guaranteed to states versus the national government, rather than a very big moral conflict over the issue of slavery. Because of this lost cause myth, we see a resurgence, especially in the early 1900s, of monuments to the Confederacy, including this fairly famous one that's been in the news for the past year or so, located on the campus of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So you can see him here on the left side of the image. This is Silent Sam. So the Silent Sam monument was constructed in honor of the students from the University of North Carolina who fought in the Confederacy. As you can see here, he holds his gun at the ready and he is facing north, right, to protect the university from northern invaders. And this is on a fairly large and significant quad that borders the university and then sort of the town of Chapel Hill, the main drag. So you really can't avoid the statue. He's in a very prominent place, or at least he was. This monument was very heavily tied towards the issue of segregation. In fact, at its dedication speech, Julian Carr, the man after whom the neighboring town of Carborough is named, gave a speech in honor of the students who had served in the Confederacy. And in his speech, he bragged about whipping when he said, as an insolent Negro woman or a Black woman, publicly bragged about whipping a Black woman in the street in his speech at the unveiling of the monument. And so this monument is very heavily tied towards this incorrect memory of the Civil War as a lost cause, not related to slavery. It's very heavily tied in the time it was built and then sort of the commemoration speech to the issues of segregation and violence against African Americans. And so students spent decades protesting the existence of this statue. And initially, the university's response was to be like, you know what, the statue is insensitive. Let's construct a memorial to the slaves who literally built our college campus, because the University of North Carolina is one of the oldest public universities in the United States and was indeed built using slave labor. So to the left of Silent Sam, you can't see it in this image, is a monument to the slaves who built the college, which is literally a low table held up by figures of slaves. And if you think that this is a little insensitive of a memorial, yeah, you're not the only one who thinks that. So student activists protested for years that this should be removed. North Carolina said, we can't do anything. We have laws protecting Confederate monuments. And then one night in 2019, activists tore down Silent Sam from his pedestal. And since then, the university has been in sort of a legal quagmire over what to do with this statue. In particular, students don't want it back. They want it to be completely removed. There was a proposal to house him in a museum and sort of contextualize the statue, which is actually the route that several other universities, including the University of Texas, has done with statues depicting former Confederates. It's been a contentious case. It's still not resolved. He's still not back on his pedestal, but he's still not destroyed either. He's at an undisclosed storage warehouse, and North Carolina continues to grapple with this, including the revelation that members of the university had sort of cooperated illegally behind the scenes with a group called the Sons of Confederate Veterans to get them to take the statue and to pay them money to take the statue. And when that came out that they had been sort of shadily negotiating, that deal was done too. So the legacy of Silent Sam still persists, even though what's going to happen to that statue has not been fully resolved as of 2020. But again, mentioning 2020, with the protests and the Black Lives Matter movement, we started to see more and more state and local governments questioning the wisdom of these Confederate monuments, many of them dating to the post-Reconstruction time period, and erected as a way of trying to enforce this lost cause myth of remembering the Civil War rather than an honest reckoning. And so we're starting to see more and more governments try to grapple with how to deal with this messy past. So the legacy of the Civil War and the legacy of the end of Reconstruction is still very much with us, more than 150 years after the end of Reconstruction. So even though this has taken place in the past, it's something that still has a lot of bearing on our present. When we talk about issues surrounding race or issues surrounding the right to vote or other kinds of things that were relevant back during and after Reconstruction, these things are still very relevant today. And in fact, much of our sort of current discussions about a lack of equality for many different groups of people in the United States, or difficulty in voting, or even contentiousness over how the Civil War is remembered, comes back from this time period and our earlier failure to adequately reckon with the legacy of the Civil War and the legacy of failed Reconstruction. On that note, Dr. Esmacher, signing off.